Good evening and welcome everyone. First, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge our university's presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. My name is Eric Hook. I'm a professor in the UCLA Sustainable LA School of Engineering and the director of the Sustainable LA Grand Challenge. Before we begin today's program, I want to review a few housekeeping tips for our audience members. Your microphone and video have been turned off to help minimize disruptions. However, if you have any questions during today's event, please use the Q&A icon located on the bottom of your Zoom window. Also, if you experience any audio or visual problems, please type in the Q&A box and we'll try to address them right away. Finally, a recording of today's event will be made available afterwards and shared with all attendees. Next slide, please. Yeah. The UCLA Sustainable LA Grand Challenge was founded in 2013. The goal of coordinating UCLA's research and education around creating a more sustainable Los Angeles in partnership with the city, the county, and various regional stakeholders. Since then, our roster of faculty and researchers and scholars who are committed to tackling climate change and creating a thriving LA has grown to more than 250, and it includes folks in nearly every discipline across campus. Our program aims to apply UCLA research, expertise, and education to help transform Los Angeles into the world's most sustainable megacity by 2050. And our vision is to make LA the most livable, equitable, resilient, clean, and healthy megacity, serving as an example for all of the world. We see ourselves as a resource for Los Angeles, and we hope that today's event serves as a good example of how we can accomplish this goal. To that end, we're gathered here today to discuss wildlife corridors and the city's proposed wildlife ordinance. The legislation's author, Councilmember Paul Caretz, who's here, hi Paul, will be providing some opening remarks before giving way to a short presentation of the wildlife ordinance by Los Angeles City Planning's Caretz. Then a panel of UCLA researchers will give their perspectives on the topic and ordinance from a variety of perspectives and given their different areas of expertise. And as well answering a mix of predetermined and also audience provided questions before the program closes at 7 p.m. Again, please feel free to use the Q&A function, type any questions you have for us, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. I'm so grateful for the speakers and panelists' participation today and for each of you for tuning in to learn about this important topic. Thank you for being here. And without further delay, allow me to introduce Los Angeles City Council Member Paul Caretz of the 5th District. Paul, please.
Well, thank you everyone for attending tonight. It's always particularly exciting to be invited by my alma mater to speak. We have a good turnout tonight, which underscores the seriousness and importance of this conversation. And I particularly want to thank Eric and Cassie Rouser and the UCLA Grand Challenges for hosting this tonight, and all our terrific expert panelists for participating, particularly Kat Superfiski, who we hired to oversee this effort within the city's planning department. And a special thanks to Vince Bertoni and his planning staff who've been working hard for several years on this ordinance. If you've been paying attention to the news about mass extinctions around the planet, if you're paying attention to the rainforest being cut or burned down about a football field size section at a time, if you're paying attention to the quickly worsening breakdown of our climate and all the accompanying extreme weather events, including our record-breaking wildfires and ever worsening mega drought, you know that we are, as a society, running out of time. 2 weeks ago, the LA City Council approved our LA 100 effort to require the LA Department of Water and Power to achieve 100% renewable energy by 2035, an initiative that President Biden's administration considers to be leading the nation. But if we simply focus on reducing our greenhouse gas emissions without actively and aggressively protecting our natural resources, we will still be lost. And for those of you who don't know, Los Angeles is situated in what is known as California Floristic Province, one of only 36 biodiversity hotspots around the world. And what this means is that we're home to some of the most unique plants and animals on Earth, which can't be found anywhere else. What this designation also means is that those plants and animals are in danger from human activities. We probably all know about P22, our famous Hollywood mountain lion. But what you may not know is that he and his fellow mountain lions are currently under consideration by the State Department of Fish and Wildlife to be listed as threatened or endangered. If we do nothing, or if we don't do enough, the Southern California mountain lions could be extinct by as early as 2050, or maybe even earlier. It means we'll have let that happen on our watch, and that's just not acceptable. Fortunately, when P22 let us discover him back in 2012, positive things started to occur around Los Angeles. I was fortunate enough to be invited to participate in 2013 when UCLA launched its exciting Sustainable LA Grand Challenge, which included assessing and protecting biodiversity and ecosystem health. Soon after in City Council, I launched both the Wildlife Corridors effort we'll hear more about tonight and a citywide biodiversity protection effort that has already garnered some international attention. People are used to hearing about LA's freeways and conspicuous consumption, but they raise their eyebrows when they hear we're protecting an apex predator right in the middle of our urban jungle. One of the more important things I've learned during my time as a council member is what a profound impact Los Angeles has on the rest of the state and quite often the rest of the world. What we do, they often do. What we protect, others go on to protect. And if we don't take action, if we don't do something right, others will often get it wrong and we'll end up protecting nothing. And our children and grandchildren would not only not get to enjoy the experiences of seeing deer and bobcats and hawks in the wild, they probably won't get to enjoy much of anything, as they'll likely simply be struggling to survive in a climate devastated, biodiversity destroyed world. We're probably the last generation to be able to do anything about this, and it is our profound and moral responsibility to get it right. So I launched this wildlife habitat connectivity project in partnership with folks who have lived in our hillside communities for decades. It was brought to us originally by hillside constituency groups and has been supported all along by hillside constituents, including the strong support of the Bel Air Beverly Crest Neighborhood Council, as well as a great number of neighborhood councils across the city, the Hillside Federation of HOAs, and most, if not all, of our individual hillside homeowners associations. Each of them understand how important this effort is to protect not only the wildlife, but the special quality of life that exists in the hillsides. The LA Times has also been quite supportive of the effort, writing 2 or 3 articles and positive op-eds about it over the years. The Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy and the wildlife advocacy groups like CLAW, which is Citizens for Los Angeles Wildlife, the Center for Biological Diversity, Sierra Club, NRDC, the Natural History Museum, and many more have been involved, working with the council and the planning department to get the word out and to educate city staff about the issues. If you haven't heard about this effort earlier, you may not have been paying careful attention. Also, there's been a lot of misinformation and fear spread about our wildlife corridor efforts. And tonight I'm hoping the experts from UCLA will help set the record straight. During COVID, a lot of people have been duped into ignoring the science. With our climate fight, a lot of people have been duped into ignoring the science as well, mainly due to fossil fuel money being poured into their wallets. Tonight, we're lucky enough to hear from our local expert scientists at UCLA about the actual science behind the Wildlife Corridors effort. We're lucky enough to have experts in biology and the law and land use and CEQA who are all digging down into the proposed ordinance. We are not intending to impact existing homes. We want this to help with fire safety and to protect quality of life, and we expect that this will actually increase property values. At the end of the day, what this ordinance will mean is that in the hillsides, Anything we build, we need to do very carefully and very consciously. Otherwise, we doom our mountain lions to extinction. We doom our deer to inbreeding and eventual extinction. We doom our bobcats and hawks to starvation and death. We increase our dangerous interactions with coyotes, and none of these are desirable outcomes. If we begin to lose animals to extinction, we begin a landslide of the rest of the species whose own well-being is tied to the others in an intricate web of life. We ignore this interconnectedness at our own peril and a grave threat to our own species. We're all in this together on one tiny, fragile, struggling planet. And quite simply, we must all do our part, from policymakers to scientists to homeowners to developers and realtors. So the most important takeaway tonight is that the ordinance that the city planning department has released after numerous well-publicized community meetings over several years is what is called a draft ordinance. It's in draft form and we're still working on it. We put out a draft ordinance so we can take in public comments and get things right. This is not intended to be retroactive. Once this ordinance overlays the hillsides, it will likely make it easier for you to build that new porch you want, because we'll have the exact specifications you need in place to do it, and you won't have to go through an extended CEQA process. Any mistakes or oversights that you have found in the draft ordinance, please provide public comment and planning will examine and address them. The ultimate goal is to keep from accidentally blocking off the last connected natural areas. And we're very close to doing that if we're not incredibly careful going forward. So thank you all for attending tonight. Thank you again to Eric and Cassie and UCLA and to the panelists. I look forward to a robust, thoughtful, and I hope enlightening discussion. And now I'd like to introduce Kat Superfisky, our biologist extraordinaire and the leader of our planning department's effort at preserving our wildlife.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you, Councilmember Caretz, for the intro, and thank you to UCLA for inviting city planning to be a part of this event, and for all of you who are taking the time out of your evenings to tune in. As was mentioned, my name is Kat Superfisky, and I serve as the urban ecologist for the Department of City Planning. And tonight I'm going to be providing a very brief overview of the wildlife pilot study and associated wildlife ordinance, and the importance of these efforts in a place like Los Angeles. Now, if additional questions arise after tonight's event, or if you would like to make a public comment on the draft of the wildlife ordinance, please visit the website or email ourla2040@lacity.org. Now, before I jump into the draft ordinance itself, let's start by first addressing why are we even talking about or working on wildlife in a place like Los Angeles? Well, here's the fun fact for your Tuesday, which Councilmember Caretz already mentioned. We within Los Angeles are actually located within a biodiversity hotspot, one of 36 global biodiversity hotspots to be exact. Now, this sounds very exciting, but what does it actually mean? Well, to be a biodiversity hotspot, a region must meet two key criteria. Number one, it must have a huge variety of plants and animals, hence the biodiversity part. But secondly, it also has to have experienced a huge amount of habitat loss, hence being termed a hotspot. So these are places on the planet where biodiversity continues to be threatened. And the existence of that biodiversity in that local area is extremely, extremely important, not only for the local area itself, but for the entire planet. And with the recent release of the draft ordinance in May of this year, the city of Los Angeles is making history and setting an extremely innovative and hopefully positively impactful precedent for how a city can play a role in ensuring that the health and stability of a planet and the populations of plants, animals, and people living on it are protected and enhanced, creating a more livable place for all communities. Now, although many plants and animals have been impacted by human development, nature still does exist in places like Los Angeles, which you can see from the map here. No, this is not actually a Magic Eye book excerpt, although if you do squint, hopefully you can see the coastline and make out the mountain ranges that define the greater LA area. But this is actually a screen capture from iNaturalist, which is an online community science platform for recording observations of nature. Each colored dot that you see on this map indicates a species observation of a plant or an animal. So this clearly shows evidence that there still is a lot of biodiversity existing here in LA. In the county of LA alone, there are over 4,000 species of plants and animals, over 50 of which are considered to be endangered or threatened. So these are key ecological resources worth protecting and enhancing. Now, many people may be surprised to know that these plants and animals can be found in many corners of our city, not just in the public parks or our open spaces. These unique biological and ecological resources in LA occur in a variety of different ecosystem types and on a variety of different land types and ownerships. In fact, in urban settings, more than a third of green space is actually found in backyards and on private property, making the management and enhancement of these resources and associated biodiversity challenging, but really important. And aside from LA having world-class natural resources and tons of plants and animals, LA also has an increase in development pressure, especially within our ecologically significant areas such as hillsides, where there are ridgelines, steep hillside slopes, water resources, and important source populations of plants and animals, making it extremely important to manage land in Los Angeles in a way that balances the need for this development with the need for these unique natural resources. And there are a multitude of different efforts underway at the international, the national, the state, the county, and the local levels to address the health of the environment, which we as humans need for our own health and survival as well. And we are doing our part here locally within the city of Los Angeles through things like the general plan, which includes a specific conservation element, the Bureau of Sanitation and Environment's One Water, Biodiversity, and Healthy Soils initiatives, the city of LA's first step towards an urban forest management plan, LA's Green New Deal, among many other initiatives, including the wildlife pilot study and associated wildlife ordinance. So now that you have kind of this high level understanding of why wildlife habitat and biodiversity are important to address, even in a place like Los Angeles, let's dive in a little bit more to the pilot study itself and that associated wildlife ordinance. Now, the wildlife pilot study is an effort that the planning department initiated back in 2016 in response to a motion introduced by Councilmember Paul Caretz of CD5, who you heard from at the start of this event. And the motion called for the department to create an ordinance with a set of land use regulations that would maintain wildlife connectivity within the city. The overall goal of the study and associated regulations is to balance wildlife habitat and connectivity with development, thereby achieving more sustainable outcomes in some of the most ecologically sensitive parts of the city. By ensuring that such development takes place in a more sustainable manner, the city can help to address and support other essential goals such as biodiversity, climate resilience, fire safety, and watershed health. And together, all of these goals create a much more livable city for all of us. Now, since the focus of tonight's event is on hearing from UCLA faculty and not from city folks like me, I'm going to provide a really brief overview of what the proposed ordinance intends to regulate and where it will apply within the city. But for those of you who are looking for additional information, again, please visit the planning website, which the link is provided at the top of the screen, for more information on both of these different efforts. Now on the webpage, you will find a link to an interactive map where you can zoom in and out and explore the Wildlife Ordinance District location in more depth, which is where the proposed regulations will apply once adopted and is outlined in cyan on the left of this map. And as you can see from this kind of larger context, this wildlife district area is located in a key patch habitat that really helps to connect the transverse ranges together, which include the Santa Monica, San Gabriel, and San Bernardino Mountains. And maintaining and enhancing habitat and connectivity in this area for wildlife is extremely essential for their existence in and movement through a place like LA and the greater region. This type of large-scale landscape planning is what is needed to ensure that the urban ecosystem of LA is managed and enhanced in a way that supports the health of plants, animals, and us. And that's exactly what the Wildlife Ordinance aims to do. The Wildlife Ordinance District includes the hillsides of the Santa Monica mountain range that roughly stretch between the 405 and 101 freeways and include the neighborhoods of Hollywood, Laurel Canyon, Bel Air, Beverly Crest, Sherman Oaks, Studio City, amongst others. Developments in this area are intermingled with undeveloped land, providing an ideal environment for piloting regulations to continue allowing urban development while maintaining and improving habitat and connectivity. The Wildlife Ordinance district boundary was determined as part of the wildlife pilot study, which helped to identify areas within the city of LA that are ecologically important or sensitive. This effort was led by a team of biologists hired by the city to conduct this assessment and included referencing LA County's significant ecological areas, which you can see in green on the map on the far left, as well as the rim of the valley corridor, which you can see in taupe on the map on the far left, high fire hazard severity zones, shown in red in the center, and probable pathways for wildlife movement within the city, illustrated on the map on the right. Now, after taking all of this into consideration, the team of biologists identified where the most ecologically intact areas still exist within the city of LA. These areas are being referred to as preliminary protection areas for wildlife, or PAWS, and are shown in green on the map to the right. Once the PAWS were identified, a smaller subset of the PAWS was selected for further study and for the development of the proposed draft regulations in the Wildlife Ordinance. Once adopted, it is intended that the regulations being proposed as part of the draft Wildlife Ordinance would eventually be expanded to all PAWS throughout the city. Because Los Angeles is a large city and hillside regulations and processes are often complex, the proposed regulations are meant to offer flexibility in development while imposing restrictions primarily in areas that are found to be most sensitive for habitat. The proposed regulations are meant to align with parallel regional efforts while complementing existing hillside city regulations, some of which you can see listed here. The new regulations being proposed in the draft Wildlife Ordinance would work together with existing regulations to meet objectives specifically for wildlife. So what are the regulations being proposed in the draft Wildlife Ordinance? Well, the proposed standards in the Wildlife Ordinance would enhance habitat and connectivity by considering factors that influence plant and animal health and mobility by regulating such things as setbacks and fencing, site disturbance, vegetation and landscaping, lighting, windows, and trash enclosures. The proposed regulations aim to provide critical habitat connectivity for wildlife by providing space in between structures for habitat retention and fire safety. It also aims to preserve resources such as ridge lines, open space and natural areas, riparian and wetland resources. Also aims to limit the removal of trees and habitat areas and promote habitat enhancement via native, non-invasive, climate adaptive and fire-wise landscaping, and improve watershed health and water quality by promoting infiltration and reducing stormwater runoff. So just a quick but really important note indicating where things are in the review and adoption process. So a draft of the Wildlife Ordinance was released to the public in May of this year, requesting public feedback. A virtual public workshop was then held in June, where comment inquiries being submitted from the public as part of the comment process were addressed, and where additional public comments and questions were gathered and responded to. Now, something really important to make note of: the proposed Wildlife Ordinance is still in draft form, as Councilmember Caretz mentioned. So public comments are still being accepted and can be submitted by emailing ourla2040@lacity.org. And will inform the version of the draft ordinance that is heard in hearings later this year. So far, the city has received comments in support of the ordinance and its regulations, as well as concerns that the ordinance is being overly restrictive. And the city is taking all comments into consideration and evaluating the draft ordinance accordingly. Public comment is going to continue to be accepted throughout the review and adoption process. So please, please, please submit your feedback once you have a chance to review the draft ordinance in more detail. So thank you all again for your time, attention, and interest in this topic. I hope that this brief presentation helped illuminate that Los Angeles really is situated in and benefits from a world-class environment, one that is still rich with natural resources and packed with important biodiversity that contributes to the health of the earth and also the quality of life of its residents. And that by elevating sustainability in the development process, the city can support biodiversity and make LA a more livable place for plants, animals, and people. And with that, I will pass the mic back to UCLA for the remainder of the event.
Hello and welcome to our panel discussion. Can I have all the panelists turn on their cameras, please? Okay, thank you. I'm Cassie Rouser. I'm the Executive Director of UCLA Sustainable LA Grand Challenge. And as you know, we are here today to create an understanding of and build awareness around wildlife corridors. in the Los Angeles region. We'll discuss how wildlife corridors may impact homeowners and future development, as well as the impacts on flora, fauna, and residents in and around these corridors. You will hear from our expert panelists, who are all faculty or researchers from UCLA, who spend their time evaluating different aspects of wildlife corridors from their unique disciplinary perspectives. So today we have with us, and if each of you could just maybe give us a little wave when I say your name. We have Beth Kent from the School of Law. We have Rebecca Mendez from the Department of Design and Media Arts. We have Jerry Nicholsberg from Anderson School of Management, Department of Economics. Stephanie Pincel from the Institute of Environment and Sustainability, and Brad Schaefer from the Institute of Environment and Sustainability and the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. So first, I just want to remind the audience that we will use the Q&A function, so feel free to submit questions for our panelists. Please do note, however, that this is not an official public forum for comments on the draft wildlife ordinance. So please do submit any comments and concerns to LA City Planning at the email that Kat provided in her presentation. I'll be asking a combination of both prepared questions and questions from the audience. And since we do not have much time, I'm just going to jump right in. So my first question I'm going to direct to Brad. And then I'm going to have Stephanie and Rebecca both comment on the question as well. And I'm going to try to limit the questions and the responses to about 3 minutes for maybe the initial response and a couple of minutes for the other responses, because we don't have a whole lot of time and want to make sure that we can cover a lot of ground. So with my first question to Brad, the Sustainable LA Grand Challenge and its ecosystem health report card for LA County reported over 4,200 recorded native species in the county, with 38 of those species endangered and 12 threatened. Both the city and the county sustainability plans do have targets of no loss of native biodiversity, and the city's proposed wildlife corridor ordinance is one strategy that we can use to help to achieve that target. But before we discuss the pros and cons of such an ordinance, I'd like our panel to help us better understand what is a wildlife corridor and what purpose does it serve in an urban space for flora, fauna, and for residents. And in answering this question, it'd be great to speak to biodiversity, the importance of biodiversity, and how wildlife corridors can even contribute to climate resiliency. Brad, take it away.
Okay, and my timer is going, Cassie.
Timer's going.
So what is a corridor? What is a wildlife corridor? Why are they important for wildlife? And when I say wildlife, I mean plants and animals. I study reptiles and amphibians, so I mean lizards and snakes, as well as mountain lions and bobcats. So a corridor is just exactly what it sounds like. It's just a connector between two patches of habitat, perhaps two paws, as we heard about. And a corridor generally needs to be more than just a little patch of space. It also needs to be sort of ecologically appropriate space. In other words, it has to be something that a plant or animal can move through. Plants can move with their seeds moving, animals can just walk through them. And they're important because basically everything we do in terms of development tends to isolate populations, isolate paws, break up what was continuous space into smaller, littler patches of isolated space. And every time we put in a road, every time we build attractive housing, every time we do just about anything, we tend to isolate things. And that's a problem. Why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem because when we isolate populations, we tend to make the population of plants and animals smaller than it was before. And when you make them too small, what that leads to is inbreeding. And Councilman Caretz mentioned inbreeding actually in his remarks. And I'm very glad he did. Inbreeding just happens when you have a very small number of individuals of plants or animals, including humans. And they have no choice but to breed with close relatives. And after a little while, a small patch of habitat becomes nothing but close relatives. When that happens, you get inbreeding depression. That means you're more susceptible to diseases. It means that your general populations start to fall apart. Corridors correct that. corridors account for that, and they allow plants and animals to move between those patches, moving the sort of genes and increasing the overall population size of the landscape as a whole. And they're incredibly important. Without them, we will lose the wildlife that we have. One of the best known ones that we're thinking about right now is the corridor connecting the Santa Monica's to the Simi Hills going over the 101 freeway. That's a corridor that will allow our mountain lion population in the Santa Monica Mountains to persist. Without it, they will be gone by probably 2035. So that's the biology of it. I'll turn it over to the others to let them comment on some of the other aspects that you mentioned, Cassie.
Great, thank you, Brad. So Stephanie, maybe you can speak a little more to the impact on residents and our coexistence with nature in a city like Los Angeles or any city.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I grew up, I'm going to tell you a little story. I grew up in San Diego, and without too much revealing my age, this is at a time when there were huge canyons that existed that interspersed between the flatland at the top of the canyon that was developed. And there was a lot of circulation of animals around San Diego County, and this was around Mission Valley. And sadly, San Diego began to allow the infill development of those canyons. And, it was cut and fill, cut and fill. And what happened was that 20 or 30 years later, people realized that devastating impact that had on wildlife, but also on sense of place and kind of sense of having this relationship with what was there before people. And San Diego began to preserve those canyon lands because they realized that it contributed enormously to people's well-being and happiness about where they lived in San Diego. You had an image of San Diego that was not simply all development, and that there were these extraordinary places of odor and animal, the odor of the chaparral, the birds, the insects, the coyotes. And it was really a tragic loss for the city. And I think that it undercut a lot of the reason why San Diego is such an attractive place to live. And in fact, if you go around the San Diego Zoo, they have preserved a lot of the open space around the San Diego Zoo, and it provides this kind of extraordinary sense of being in Southern California in this specific kind of place. So that comes with the fauna and the flora. You can't have one and not the other, right? And so we have to really engage with the places we live and relearn why we are here, really, by wanting to coexist, because that's what is so attractive about living here. You can't have, it's a subtle, ephemeral kind of sense of place that these wildlands bring to our everyday existence in Southern California. So.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. Rebecca, I'd love to hear your unique perspective as a designer and an artist.
Thank you, Cassie, and thank you, Brad and Casey and Stephanie. I think that perhaps what I'm interested in is, I'm working towards is how art and design can be used to create habitat and engage residents in this critical wildlife corridor idea. So perhaps I can just start with the role of art and design and how it plays in tackling the complex challenges of the ecological crisis and environmental injustice as well. Because I believe that this is due to the special power that they have to boldly reimagine the world and the way we choose to interact with it. So, I see that, art and design can perhaps make you feel something or keep you engaged and help you deeply care. So that's where we begin. And, you know, if you think of it, almost everything has been designed by humans for humans. And at the lab, at the Counterforce Lab, we're interested in learning how other species design, apply what we learn to better design for humans, and at the same time design for other species, right? So with that in mind, we are designing the Biophilia treehouse, where the LA County birds are our clients. And our impetus is to enter into an interspecies friendship with wild animals. So of course, corridors have everything to do with this because we want them to be very healthy. And, you know, I don't know if your audience knows, but LA County is the birdiest county in the United States with 527 recorded species. But of course, urbanization has fractured bird habitats severely, threatening many native species. So the artwork that we are creating, the Biophilia Treehouse, is a public arts initiative to create and grow, actually grow. We plant things and we graft the trees, and we grow a series of living sculptures using native plants and trees that together constitute a complete ecosystem for some of LA's most threatened birds. When grown in sequence, a Biophilia treehouse forms a wildlife corridor. So we put them in a specific locations that we have identified. Specifically, we're looking in areas that are park poor, around the LA River, like the South LA River, but there's so many areas where that connected fracture habitat and especially, you know, where dense parts of the city, there are also against environmental inequities that are abound. So the Biophilia Treehouse is about the co-creation of art and storytelling with communities, biodiversity, and the reconnection of bird habitats and art and science education, especially the little ones. I want a young person to love a flower and a little bird as much as they love their little sister. So we know we need to start young. But this idea, I think that what Brad spoke about, you know, we are our wildlife corridors with the Biophilia Treehouse, it's our stepping stones. We're really connecting them because this idea of the population decline and collapse is so devastating when they start interbreeding. So this is the goal, to really create these stepping stones.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. That's a very interesting and unique perspective. I'm going to move on to the next question. I'm going to direct this one to Jerry and then allow Stephanie and Brad to chime in. And this one is about the ordinance that, of course, is open for public comment right now. And it's written to have multiple benefits. So not just for the flora and fauna, but like we said, for the residents. So it addresses things like climate resiliency, fire safety, and watershed health. So we're heading into peak wildfire season here in LA. And of course, we recognize that the frequency intensity of those wildfires have increased due to climate change. We also know from the Sustainable LA Grand Challenge Ecosystem Health Report Card that we published earlier this year that approximately 21% of LA County's total area is categorized as very high fire hazard. And that is, you know, that brings about 2 million residents living near these very high fire hazard areas. So I'm asking you to please speak to how the wildlife ordinance might contribute to managing the threat of wildfires to residents in their homes or other co-benefits of such an ordinance from your perspective.
Yes, thank you, Cassie. That's actually a big question. And I'm not an expert as to whether or not these corridors increase or decrease the risk of wildfires, but you know, as was stated earlier, they're designed to decrease the risk of wildfires. You know, one of the costs of living in the urban wildlife interface is wildfires and protection against those with insurance. So if this in fact decreases the risk of wildfires, then it decreases the cost of insurance, and also it decreases the risk of just loss. That, of course, will enhance property values because you have lower costs, and these, you know, homes in the hills are valued, and so we'll get higher property values based on that. You know, one thing we know a lot about in economics is what determines property values. And certainly, why do people live in the hills? Why do people live, and I do myself, in areas where to nature is the connectivity to nature is something that we value. And you can see that in the demand for housing. You can see it in the both the rent and home price gradients that, and there's this tension of living close to wildfires. So to the extent that this ordinance would reduce the risk of wildfires near the corridors, it will enhance property values. And so that's kind of the simple economics of it. And with that, I think I've used my brief time for this answer. And
Yes, thank
turn
you,
it over to
Jared.
other panelists.
So I'm gonna turn it over to Stephanie to maybe speak a little bit about other types of multiple benefits that are associated with this ordinance with regard to land use.
Yeah, so I wanted to say a couple of things. One is that this is going to really apply mostly to new development. And one of the important aspects of new development is really the hardening of the houses through code to fire. And so in fact, in a paradoxical way, it ought to help reduce the risk of houses burning up because they will be built much better to withstand fire. We've learned a lot about how to build housing now with all the experience that we've had. Sorry to say, it's a terrible thing, but it's true. But the other thing that this ordinance does is it preserves the kinds of open space that is really important for stormwater infiltration. One of the tragedies of Southern California really is that we've built on some of the best lands for where water infiltrates into the ground to our ample groundwater resources. And so to the extent that we protect these kinds of places, and we know that rain actually follows a very interesting gradient. There's more rain as you go up the hillsides, although the top of Mount Wilson is a little out of our scope. It's still pretty important to be able to maintain these areas that are open for this kind of infiltration. And the truth of the matter is there's not a lot to do in the end if you live in a fire-prone region. You just do, and it's part of where we live. So I think that this ordinance has thought very, very carefully about it, that we are that the insurance agencies are also been consulted in this ordinance, and that the best possible science and technology has been applied to creating an ordinance that will protect as much housing as possible in the least impactful way for the homeowner.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. Brad, did you want to speak to wildfires?
Yeah, I'll just say very, very quickly. So first of all, with respect to wildfire, read the ordinance. I mean, read it carefully. I actually think it's really interesting, and I normally hate these kinds of things. It's very well written. And one of the things that the ordinance really emphasizes is maintaining, enhancing, replacing non-native species with native species of plants, be it annual plants, little shrubs, trees, whatever. And in doing that many invasive plants in Southern California really, really suck up a lot of water and blow it up into the atmosphere and reduce the water table. You get native plants in there that are dormant during the summer. It really reduces that impact. It increases our water table. That helps with wildfire. The second is that pretty much all invasives are very fire prone. Now, so are some natives, but the non-natives are really bad in terms of being fire prone. And again, by getting rid of those non-native plants, those invasive plants, and replacing them in a very deterministic way with natives, it will very much help. And the third is that we all know this, just to hold a match upside down, and you can feel this on your fingers. Fires go upslope, right? They move up, the hot air moves, the fire moves up. The ordinance does everything it can to keep new development off of those very steep slopes. Those are the most fire-prone areas. What does that mean? It means that it's avoiding places, putting houses where they will burn up, and it's keeping those slopes intact and healthy going into the future. So all of those are just some of the areas where the ordinance really, I think, will make a substantive difference in terms of protecting us against and avoiding wildfires.
Great, thanks, Brad. Those are really great points. Thanks, all of you. I'm going to move on to the next question because these are some questions that I know I've seen from homeowners in the area, and we definitely want to address some of those concerns. So there were a number of homeowners that have concerns about the ordinance and how it will affect them and their property, of course. For example, some fear that the ordinance would severely restrict what you can do with your own home and yard, and that it would take away property rights. And so I'm looking to you, Beth, to please discuss what the ordinance does and does not do from a legal standpoint.
So let's start by talking about what the ordinance does. So it does two things. It establishes a wildfire ordinance district. And then for homes within the district, it creates regulations that place some restrictions on new development. So when homeowners who live within the district want to expand the footprint of their homes, they're going to be subject to restrictions regarding where they can build and how tall and large these new structures and additions can be. And there's also some landscaping and design requirements, but it only applies to new developments. So existing homeowners won't be impacted unless they're planning an addition or structural renovation or to entirely tear down their homes and rebuild. And even for projects that involve some type of alteration, if the project is only an interior construction or an addition of less than 500 square feet, then it's not subject to the ordinance unless it's in these very special designated resource buffer areas. So for many homeowners, if you're planning to just use your property the way you've always used it, then you won't be affected. And then for the homeowners who do want to build an addition or make a significant structural alteration or completely demolish and rebuild their homes, there will be some additional permitting requirements, but these are the types of renovations that already require permits and various approvals from the city. And the additional requirements are really designed to prevent the wildfires and protect wildlife that the other panelists have talked about. And they're really intended to keep both the environment and the homeowners and your neighbors safe. So there's definitely some benefits to it.
Great, thank you. And Brad spoke a little bit to the hillside, so I'm going to actually move on to the next question because I do want to give us a little bit of time to try to address some of the questions coming in through the Q&A. And I do want to note that any questions that are presented in the Q&A, we will be saving this, sending this to LA City Planning. They will have access to all of your comments and questions that you're entering here. So if we don't get that to them tonight, they will at least be read and addressed by City Planning. So I'm going to move on to the next question, which is for you, Jerry. Want to talk a little bit more about some of the concerns we heard from homeowners. And the biggest one is, of course, that it may decimate property values. Now, you already spoke to property values as it relates to the probability of wildfires. So what else could you tell us about how this ordinance might affect those values based on research in similar areas?
Sure. So one thing we know a lot about is what determines the value of homes. And of course, realtors will tell you location, location, location. And there's really something to that, the research into real estate prices clearly demonstrates that proximity to natural amenities, including open space and natural space, are enhancers to property values. And so if we think about this ordinance, and the ordinance is preventing new development, so that's lowering the risk that open space that is close to where the homes are is going to be developed, is going to be paved over, and that one will lose both the visual and the recreational value of that open space. If that were lost, that would reduce property values. All the evidence that we have is that maintaining the open space and reducing that risk will, at most, keep property values where they are, but probably will enhance them. And as the economy grows, as the demand for housing grows, with less housing being close to these open spaces, you can expect appreciation of home values more rapidly than other areas of the city. And just maybe a final comment on that, because just to sort of illustrate it and take it away from the ordinance per se, if one thinks about us living on the coast, about say Fresno or Visalia, we think, well, those are really inexpensive places to live because they're inland California. They're actually fairly expensive places to live relative to Akron or Oklahoma City. And the reason is they're close to the Sierras, they're in the foothills of the Sierras, they're near that open space, they're near nature. That boosts property values. So I think that's the way that we need to think about it. And the data is, provides us abundant evidence that that's the case.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm going to take a couple of questions from the Q&A, and I have someone assisting me, so they've been curated. And if there are multiple questions asking the same thing, we've tried to put them together to address them. So I love this first question. I live in the Franklin Canyon area where we used to hear birds singing 24 hours a day. Now we rarely hear bird song. Would you expect that the wildlife corridor might bring back some of the birds? As a resident, do you have suggestions about what we might do to provide a welcoming habitat for birds? So I'm actually going to give this to Rebecca first, and then I'm going to have Brad comment on it. So
Yeah, that's a beautiful question, because it is, my love of birds and exactly the song, right? I'm hearing right now the most beautiful little, hummingbirds just going. So anyway, I think that one of the things that you can find, I think I put the Biophilia Treehouse website there, is that we worked with an evolutionary biologist who helped us, and with ornithologists, to look at the indicator species, which are the species whose presence or absence really gives us a sense of the health of the ecosystem. So you can begin to see, what do they like? What do they eat? What plants do they like to be in? For example, if you want woodpeckers to come to your place, just like really put like a piece of dead wood in there. So there's a way that you can, and that's, you can learn what they like. Imagine them being your friend, and you then begin to kind of befriend them and give them gifts. What do they love to do? But a lot of this is very much understanding in your region what indicator species, what species really would give you a sense of the health of your habitat. Once you learn that, you then immediately start connecting what plants they love, how do they forage, what do they eat, and you yourself begin to create the habitat to create really a stepping stone for them to come to you.
great, perfect. And Brad? Maybe
Real quick.
1 minute or less.
1 minute or less. So absolutely, the ordinance will help bring birds back into Franklin Canyon, as well as many other places. It just has to. And, even with birds, which we think of as being able to kind of fly over areas, and so, they kind of don't need corridors as much. Simply not true. Things like quail, for example, California quail, one of the sort of quintessential, species of the hills and open spaces of Southern California, in huge decline because of them being isolated by roads, isolated by housing. Quail don't like to go across those areas. And there's lots of other birds that are like that. So it absolutely will bring them in. And then I would also, just sort of build on what Rebecca said and say, look at your property and look at how you can make it friendlier for wildlife. And, it's easy. I mean, in many ways, it's really easy. Get rid of your, grass if you've got any. Just get rid of the stuff and put in some native shrubs. And I mean, maybe you can choose exactly the right ones that are mostly going to bring in the best constellation of hummingbirds, or you can just say anything's better than a bunch of Bermuda grass. Just get rid of this stuff. And when you put in native plants and shrubs and some structure, animals like structure. They like to hide. They like to kind of, have little hidey holes where they can get away from things. That really helps. The other thing is get rid of cats. If you've got cats that go outside, get rid of them. That really, really helps a lot. Okay.
Or just keep them inside. You don't have to get rid of them.
Do not let them outside.
So we are coming upon 7 o'clock, but if it's okay with everyone, I'm going to let us run over just a couple of minutes. And honestly, if any of you panelists need to jump off, I understand. But I have a couple of other questions that I'd love for us to be able to address. So another question from the audience is, how have home surveillance cameras changed understanding of how wildlife moves across the city? For example, the recent footage where a mountain lion is walking down a sidewalk in Studio City. I did just see that today. So I'm not sure, can anyone speak to that on our panel? Brad?
Well, of
Have we
course
looked
I can.
at
They've been absolutely huge. I mean, they're absolutely huge, for a very limited amount of money. The thing is that an awful lot of wildlife that we care about, and it doesn't matter if it's snakes or mountain lions or skunks or, whatever it is, an awful lot of wildlife is nocturnal. They come out at night when we're inside watching Netflix or asleep. And so wildlife cameras just open up that whole world to us. And it doesn't matter, I live right in the middle of LA. My neighbors pick up stuff going down our fence lines all the time on their cameras, on their security cameras. A colleague of mine just has a little water bowl out in his backyard up in Malibu Canyon, and he got a mountain lion coming in to get a drink out of. I mean, just never would have thought it. So they're absolutely huge. They're wonderful. They're a great way to connect with the wildlife in your neighborhood or in your backyard. So I'm all for it.
And I'm in a completely urban space. So instead of seeing the wonderful mountain lions and everything, I see rats and I see mapaches, right, which are the raccoons. So I call my cam a mapache cam because they do beautiful things, and it just makes you love your environment because the little mice and the rats are very beautiful.
Yeah, they're fantastic. Absolutely.
All right, I'm going to just pose this one last question that I know last night when we were discussing the panel, everyone here on the panel, that we knew this was going to come up. So there are 3 different questions that are related to how the ordinance might impact the housing crisis. And I think we can give a couple of quick responses based on the discussions we had yesterday about this. So maybe, Jerry, do you want to maybe start with that one, and maybe Stephanie pipe in? Beth, if you have anything to say too, it'd be great to hear from you.
Sure. So I'll start. And the short answer is it'll have very little impact, because building homes in the hills of Los Angeles is expensive. And the housing crisis in Los Angeles, in California, and in many parts of the US is about affordable housing. It's about housing that you would build inexpensively, multifamily housing predominantly. That's the kind of housing that you would build in the flats, not in the hills. And so this will have very little effect. It won't move the needle one way or another on the housing crisis that we have in California.
Great, thank you, Stephanie.
I actually don't have very much to add to that. I think actually that the Hillside Ordinance would prevent multifamily, multi-unit housing being located in a vulnerable hillside area. And so it's a kind of double-edged sword, right? Because people who live in affluent neighborhoods don't want affordable housing because they're afraid that it's going to impact their property values. And at the same time, there's concern about housing. So, it's a kind of complicated situation, but overall, I completely agree with Jerry It would be nice though if some of, people would build granny flats or, transform their garage for people to be able to live in. And I think that's probably not prevented by the ordinance. But we have to think about really the kind of city we want to live in and where we want people to have a place to live that is affordable, but they can also go somewhere. Because remember, a lot of people who don't have very much money, who need housing, also don't have cars. So we saw that situation actually in a very poignant way during the fires when people went to work. Their employers were gone, they evacuated, but they went to work anyway. So it's a very complicated, no win-win answer to that. And we just do what we can in the most straightforward and heartfelt way, I think is the answer to that.
Did anyone else want to speak to that question?
I'll just say really quickly, I know there were a couple of questions about SB 9 and 10 specifically, which just passed. I haven't, taken a close read of all the legislation, so I don't want to speculate on how it will or won't interplay with this ordinance. But what I will say is, since it just passed, I'm sure the city has their eye on it and will think about how that may or may not impact the ordinance. And if you're somebody who really wants to now build a duplex on your property, that's definitely something to put in the public comments to the city so they can kind of balance both the housing crisis needs and the wildlife and wildfire safety needs. So that's my pitch to, make sure to share your public comments with the city.
I might add, it's something we discussed last night, is that much of this space is, again, very high fire hazard zone. And so putting housing and low-income housing or, any type of density-rich housing in a place that will likely come across a wildfire is putting an undue burden on the folks that might live in those places too. So something else to think about. Okay, well, we're 6 minutes after 7, and I don't want to keep people too long. And I want to thank all of our panelists so much for being with us tonight. Your perspectives were greatly appreciated, and the diversity of your perspectives is always so refreshing. So thank you so much. And to the audience, I want to thank you for attending. Thank you for your interest in this topic. Like I said, the questions will be passed on to city planning. We will also follow up with a couple of links that we shared with you tonight. So anybody that RSVP'd to the event will receive links to the different things that we referenced. For inquiries related to UCLA or the Sustainable LA Grand Challenge, you of course can email us at sustainablela@ucla.edu. And to make further comments specifically regarding the draft wildlife ordinance, you can email ourla2040@lacity.org. And I encourage you to do that and be a part of this iterative process. Thank you so much, and everyone have a great evening.